Welcome to an extra tidbit. We're studying, or have been studying, the Epistle to the Hebrews. And one of the issues that often arises in discussion is related to the peculiar faith of the Seventh-day Adventist. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen, and let me introduce you to one of the intriguing subjects of our faith. As Adventist, Seventh-day Adventist, we may be known for emphasizing that there will be a future judgment. Now, officially, all Christians do so. It's part of the Apostolic Confession, the Apostolic Creed. As Adventists, we also believe that there is a phase of the final judgment that takes place before Jesus arrives, before his return, where it is investigated whether you and I or anyone whose name is written in the book of life believes in Jesus. Further, as Adventists, we believe that this final judgment, including the pre-Advent section of faith, is prefigured, illustrated typologically through the sanctuary festival called Yom Kippur, often translated as Day of Atonement. And this brings us to Hebrews. Because people who have disagreed or even attacked the Adventist faith have at times done it from this perspective. They have read Hebrews and say, this is not what we read. Back in the 1890s, there was a pastor by the name of Ballinger who started that line of attack. He read Hebrews and as he read it, said, but Hebrews teaches that Jesus has begun the Day of Atonement. He has entered the most holy in the heavenly sanctuary. And he read it this way, that meant that the service in the holy part of the heavenly sanctuary was illustrated in the Jewish dispensation in previous times up to the cross. So, this was his division. The Israelite services in the tabernacle and the temple was equal to the service in the holy in heaven, while the Day of Atonement, the judgment, took place when Jesus ascended to heaven after his crucifixion. Now, that created some difficulties for Ballinger, certainly. One of them was illustrated by his answer to the question, but who was then priest in the heavenly sanctuary, in the holy department, before the cross of Christ? His answer was Melkisedek and the angels. You may ask, what would make Melkisedek and the angels worthy of being priests in the heavenly sanctuary? That's another question. Now, in the 1970s and 80s, Desmond Ford, a prominent speaker and theologian from Australia, shared similar thoughts. Now, he did not go into the question about who could be priest in the heavenly sanctuary before Christ, but he did read Hebrews in a similar way, that Jesus had gone into the most holy, therefore the Day of Atonement, the typology of the Day of Atonement had begun, and the service in the holy would have become obsolete. Now, is that so? Let's first reflect on the mention of the Day of Atonement in Hebrews. Is it there? And the answer is yes. There are definite references to rituals that belong to the Day of Atonement. The blood of bulls, Jesus bringing the blood into the most holy. It is definitely language that belongs to the Day of Atonement. But note, The language of the sanctuary in Hebrews is not limited or exclusively related to the Day of Atonement. There are many other rituals that are mentioned. The point is that the contrast in Hebrews is not between the service in the most holy and the service in the holy. The contrast is between the service in the earthly copy, the earthly shadow, the earthly sanctuary, and the service in the heavenly sanctuary. In that service, the most holy, or the Day of Atonement ritual, is certainly a climax, and it is therefore important. But it is the sanctuary service as a whole that is compared between the two. Let me illustrate by reading. In the ending of chapter 8, the author of Hebrews underlines how the new covenant can be established due to the blood of Christ. And that means there now is true forgiveness. Verse 12 and 13 in chapter 8. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear. This is a contrast not between the holy and the most holy, but between what was on earth and what is in heaven. Some years back I read a discussion between my two good friends, Norm Young and Richard Davidson, who published a couple of articles in Andrews University Seminary Studies on these issues. And as expected from these two gentlemen, these articles were extremely learned and detailed, and I was sitting with the impression afterwards that I was probably illiterate, because these guys are very learned. How would I be the one to distinguish between the two and say this is right and this is wrong? Don't expect ordinary readers to reach that level of expertise and be able to assess those very intricate questions related to Greek grammar and typology and so on. So are we lost? Let me use another perspective. That's a more simple one, in order to settle the issue. When you look at the sanctuary and the two apartments, then you have in the holy department, do we say compartment, apartment, department? Is always confusing to me. But in the holy, you have the shewbread, showing that God is caring for his people. You have an altar of incense, illustrating that God is listening to our prayers. And you have the menorah, the light stand, showing how God through the Holy Spirit is reaching out to us. Let me ask you, on the basis of the text we read, are these functions of the sanctuary now obsolete? Because if the Jewish dispensation was an illustration of what went on in the holy department of the heavenly sanctuary, then this has become obsolete. If you read Hebrews, certainly God still cares for his people. Certainly the Holy Spirit still speaks. That is what is said in 3:7. So as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice. Does God not still listen to our prayers? 7:25. Therefore, Jesus is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. So this intercession, the function of the symbolic function of the altar of incense, is still going on. It hasn't become obsolete. So what the Hebrews is speaking about is not the replacement of the service in the holy with the service in the Most Holy. What Hebrews is speaking about is the replacement of the earthly sanctuary with the inauguration of the new one. And that is said very explicitly in chapter 9. Let me read. Verse 18. This is why even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood. And then there is a description of what Moses did, and there are quotes from the Old Testament, inauguration of the tabernacle. What we have in the New Testament with the ascension of Jesus is the inauguration of the heavenly sanctuary. And then tell me, how would it be possible for the heavenly sanctuary to be set legally in order, to be inaugurated legally, before the sacrifice on Calvary was brought? Ballinger minimized the significance of the cross and the sacrifice of Jesus by claiming that the heavenly sanctuary's most holy service could function before. So, that is a typology of the, you could say, the furniture, the interior of the holy. What about the most holy? What about the typology of the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur? Let's remember there are two aspects of the typology. You first have the sacrifice. All festivals, all rituals had a sacrifice or more sacrifices. Whatever their typology was, whatever they historically pointed to as, for instance, the Day of Pentecost for the Feast of Weeks, all sacrifices pointed to one and one event only. That is the death of Jesus as our sacrifice on the cross of Calvary. That aspect of the typology of the Day of Atonement was also fulfilled and completed on the cross. But the other aspect, that which has to do with judgment, what about that? What does Hebrews say? And that is very clear. To Hebrews as to other Christian writers of the New Testament, the judgment was still future. Actually, this is one of the reasons that Luther was skeptical about Hebrews, that he feared that it put too little emphasis on assurance and too much emphasis on the judgment. Because if there is still a judgment to come, you may get lost if you take a wrong direction and reject Christ. Let's read from the great conclusion to this theme in Hebrews from chapter 12. In chapter 12 it is said like this from verse 22, "You have come to Mount Zion, to the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of the living God. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn. You have come to God, the judge of all men." So there is a judgment, and this is a judgment to come. As it said later on, "Once more I will shake not only earth but also the heavens." And the author concludes that this judgment is to come. Is it scary? Well, the words may be scary, but let's note how he expresses it in verses 24 and 25. "You have come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks." If they did not escape when they refused him, and referring back to the judgment of the people in the wilderness generation. Now notice, there is a future judgment. See to it that you do not disobey. See to that you listen. What are you to listen to? The words of him who speaks, and he speaks according to the text through his blood. Don't be afraid of judgment, because you will be judged through the blood, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. You're not to be investigated to see whether you are perfect or sinless. Believe me, that's far too late. But God will, the heavenly beings will attest. God will let it be seen that you believe in Jesus Christ and his sacrifice. That is what it is about. And that investigation, of course, cannot take place before you live. Therefore, it is pre-Advent. Because when Jesus comes, the matter is settled. And therefore it is just before the second coming, because there is still time. Thank you for listening to this extra tidbit on a topic of great significance for our understanding, not only of Hebrews, but also of the message of the Bible. Thank you.